The gym lights hummed like a held breath. A sea of folding chairs, a banner for the annual fundraising gala, the bleachers half full with parents who had come for the pie auction and the student talent showcase. Somewhere near the concession stand, a spill had left a dull smear on the tiles. Water spread like a careless thought across the floor. Bernard Kellerman, a custodial worker whose shift should have ended hours earlier, moved with the slow, precise economy of someone who has learned to make space for misfortune. He knelt to blot the spill, palm pressed to the mop head as if steadying himself more than the equipment. Then a voice rose, sharp and entitled, cutting through the murmur of applause and small conversations. The man who owned the voice stepped forward like a man who believed a school was an extension of his living room. He was tall, his jacket new enough to show different lines from the workers' jackets. He had the practiced glare of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He pointed at the janitor with the same casual aggression that sometimes plays as authority. "Get up," he said. The world around Bernard narrowed to that command. He looked up because he had to, because the man's hand was already on his shoulder, hard enough to bruise an old certainty into fear. "You clean it properly," the man went on, and his tone made the demand a performance. People turned, phones lifted, a student laughed, someone whispered, another pointed. The man pushed Bernard down by the shoulder until his knees hit the cold tile. The mop clattered beside him. For 3 seconds Bernard's entire life compressed into a few images. The fluorescent glare on the floor, the sting of the shove in his shoulder, the weight of other people's stares. He could hear Molly in his mind, her small voice asking if there were monsters under the bed. He could feel the night shift in his fingertips, the acrid scent of bleach that had become as familiar as his own skin. He worked to keep his face level, to not show hurt. The first instinct was to rise, to correct the course of that moment, but the hand on his shoulder tightened. The entitled man insisted on a spectacle. Someone filmed it. A shot taken from the side, the angle that would later be saved and sent like a stone through glass, caught Bernard mid-kneel, head bowed as if in contrition. The man moved around him like a director staking a punishment. Parents in front row nudged each other. Teachers in the back looked away, their faces small and private. The principal, standing by the podium, watched with a face that betrayed a flicker of indecision, shock maybe, or the recognition of the problem she felt she had no authority to fix in that moment. The clip that would spread later was only a breath long. Bernard on his knees, a man's hand leveled in accusation, the flash of a student's grin, a headline forming in the mind of anyone who saw it. Phones hummed and glowed.
The clip traveled out of the gym as quickly as it had been made. It arrived online with no explanation, a single frame frozen and then replayed into infinity. Bernard's knees on the tile, the man's finger like a judge's gavel. Screens outside the school showed the frame and begged an interpretation. Comments stacked under the posts like small stones. Condemnation, outrage, a smattering of sympathy that arrived late and never loudly. A rumor metastasized in the gaps between tweets that the janitor had been doing something worse than kneeling to clean, that the act in the frame was an admission, that the school had allowed an abuser to stay on the payroll. The principal's assistant was the first to receive the direct message. By the time the school secretary heard, the hashtag had a life of its own. Principals and district officials texted, some in hushed tones, others with the quick, decisive language the digital age breeds. Investigate, statement, suspend. In an hour, facts were secondary to optics. The school superintendent, nervous and practiced at the art of neutral language, called for a temporary leave while they sorted things out, the phrase constructed to sound procedural and fair while it quietly steadied itself against the violent wind of public opinion. They asked Bernard to go home. He walked out of the gym with his mop like a soldier carrying a flag of surrender. Students watched with a mix of curiosity and hunger for narrative. Some cheered the entitled man in a way that would later cause remorse. Some watched in stunned silence. Bernard's supervisor said he could explain. The supervisor's voice was small and clipped, the kind of voice that had been trained in damage control. The custodial closet smelled of lemon cleaner and old socks. It had always been a private place where Bernard could fold his hands and count the minutes until he could be somewhere else. That day, it smelled like accusation. At home, the hallway light burned when he fumbled for his key. Molly slept with a stuffed rabbit tucked by her cheek, hair tangled in ways only a 5-year-old's can be. She opened one eye as he entered and then widened it in recognition. "Daddy?" she asked, voice still soft with sleep. Bernard's mouth worked around some equivalently small lies. "I'm fine, kiddo," he said, because that was the script he knew. He took off his jacket and hung it on the hook like armor discarded. He listened to the rhythmic creak of the apartment and tried to imagine himself as someone who could sleep and breathe and not have the grain of the day stuck under his fingernails. The kitchen was small. The bills were stacked where he had left them earlier that week with an orderly cruelty. When a neighbor's knock came, he almost didn't answer, but Janet Holloway opened the door with a casserole that had no relation to what had happened, that is, until she learned.
She sat on the couch and put the casserole on the coffee table like a talisman against calamity. Janet had lived on the floor below for 9 years. She had the kind, blunt way of someone who had kept plants alive through winters and taught a neighborhood kid to ride a bike. She had watched Bernard raise Molly, saw the way he traded nights for extra hours, observed how he read bedtime stories with a voice roughened by the day. "Did you see it?" she asked without preamble. The television in the corner was silent. She had seen the clip on her phone. She did not look away when he tried to answer. She set the casserole down and kept her hands busy, like someone nodding a plan. "It wasn't what it looks like," Bernard said. He searched for facts more than feelings. He wanted to say specifics, that he had been cleaning, that he had not touched a child, that he had been shoved, that his back still ached from kneeling. But the facts did not matter in the hour the clip took to compress a lifetime. The internet wanted edges, and the public wanted villains. "Of course," Janet said, "but you know how this goes. People see one frame and they write the rest." Bernard had never wanted attention. He kept his head down at school, moved through corridors like a ghost with purpose. His life orbited around one small, brilliant object, Molly, and around dignity, the way he kept his shirts clean for parent-teacher nights, the way he braided her hair into a ponytail that somehow managed to smile. He had no time for the theater of power, and yet suddenly power had come for him, in the shape of a man who treated a school like a stage and a janitor like a prop. Word at the school hardened into policy by afternoon. The district's PR page posted a carefully worded notice. The school had been made aware of a disturbing video. The matter was under review. The school did not tolerate abuse. Those who read the notice as reassurance felt relieved. Those who read it as deflection felt angrier. Parents substituted the post for investigation. Online, someone pointed to a prior disciplinary file in a different district and suggested a pattern. The smear found momentum in the unexamined spaces between posts and headlines. Bernard's phone did not ring with friends. It rang with numbers that belonged to parents he had never met, to people who demanded explanations that were as loud as they were rude. His supervisor called with the official instructions: "Take leave, do not engage with media, await HR." The language was soft, almost kind, until the pause where caution became betrayal. "It's standard," the supervisor said. "We'll figure it out." "Figure it out," Bernard echoed into the blank bedroom, feeling the phrase land like a tile breaking. How do you figure out the story of your own life when a frame has already told another version? In the staff lounge, a kevil shrieked, and teachers clustered in pods like small islands of concern.
Some were furious that a colleague had been publicly humiliated. Others were quietly afraid of the speed with which a rumor could destroy a paycheck and a life. There was an instinct to correct the record, to tell a fuller truth, but the majority hesitated. Past experiences taught them that stepping into this kind of fight risked reputation. The principal, Elena Rivera, found herself moving between those stations of thought like a person trying on clothes before a long journey. She had been at the school for 8 years. She had presided over graduations, over disciplinary hearings, over more than one messy PTA meeting. She had been raised on a version of leadership that required facing storms with measured tones and well-constructed statements. Elena had watched the clip in the gym with a stomach-quieting sensation. She had been standing near the podium, clipboard in hand, prepared to introduce the next act, and when she saw the confrontation, she thought she had seen something. A scuffle? A misunderstanding? But the moment had passed too quickly, the crowd too loud, her obligation to the evening too immediate, and she had not moved. That hesitation settled into her like a stone. Watching the replay on her phone that evening, she felt the stone grind in her chest. In the short video on her screen, the frame that people had seized looked damning. It fit the narrative the web wanted to make black and white. But Elena had a memory of something that did not appear in the clip. A child's hand, a shoe scuffing overhead, a flash of cloth. She could not be sure. Memory, she knew, is not evidence, but memory has a weight. By nightfall, the school office was a hub of quiet activity, the fluorescent lights aging into a sterile glow. The superintendent, a man practiced in the art of bland reassurances, sent an email. "Pending investigation, we ask staff and families to refrain from speculation." The message kept everyone safely in the middle. Meanwhile, whispers in the PTA group formed into a chorus. How could the school allow such a thing? How could a janitor be seen like that? There was a current of moral anger that thrummed with the speed of social media.
Then the district's external counsel appeared in the form of Victor Hale, a polished man who had made a career in crisis management. He had the voice of someone who could turn outrage into a spreadsheet. He met Elena in her office with a map of consequences. "We have to be strategic," he said. "The board will want to be seen taking action. The donors will be watching. We need to protect the school. A temporary leave is the right first step." Elena listened. She saw the logic of containment. Remove the element that had become the focus of anger, calm the water, present a plan. But she also felt something else, a personal twitch of conscience that burned when she imagined Bernard alone under judgment.
The pressure to be neat and efficient warred with a different responsibility, to see the truth, however inconvenient. She excused herself to the office across the hall and pulled up the school's security feed. There were 3 cameras in the gym, each with a different angle. Someone else had, in the noise of that night, neglected to disable the record feature. The footage saved everything. She set the clip to play. The first frames were the expected ones: applause, bright smiles, the crowd's noise as a track of normalcy. Then the man swept into the frame. The same jacket, the same jaw. Bernard was there, mop in hand, steady. The entitled parent moved closer, raised his voice. Elementary drama. Then the sequence that had not fit into the social parser. An accidental tumble of a child's foot into the spill. A child's yelp. Bernard's body bending not to shame but to reach. A reflex that in the raw moment was quick and unremarked. He knelt to clean, to protect a child from slipping. The entitled parent's shove came after, not before. In that full arc, the shape of responsibility shifted, and the frame's meaning changed, as if someone had spun the dimmer on a light. Elena paused the footage. She felt the room tilt. To her left, the superintendent's neutral emails seemed suddenly like evasions. To her right, Victor's practical plan had the texture of convenience. She thought of the parents who had already started drafting angry posts, of the donors who might call the board, of the teachers who may never again feel safe to speak up. And she thought of Bernard, who had likely approached the job that night as always, quietly, with care he rarely saw returned. The next morning, the school lobby began to fill with a different kind of press than it had the night before. Phones beeped with new messages, editors asking for comment. A local news van idled at the curb, lights blinking like a heartbeat. The PTA president paced, making her frustration into a form of business. The entitled man arrived with the same tight jaw, in a new entourage, a parent who had always used his influence as currency. He complained loudly, and people on the periphery took notes and began to select allies. The principal's office filled with muted arguments, the kind that escalated in decibels rather than in clarity. Bernard had not slept well. Janet listened to him make coffee at 3 in the morning. He had been on the phone with an HR number that went nowhere. He tried not to think about the fund he'd been contributing toward Molly's kindergarten trip. He tried not to allow his mind to wrench toward eviction notices. He had always believed that work would save him, that showing up would be enough. The viral clip taught him that showing up could also be a sentence. At school, a line formed at the security office. The principal's assistant handed a printed statement to a reporter and then to a teacher who had asked the right questions at the right time. The narrative the school first offered was the careful, neutral one. We are aware. We are investigating. Meanwhile, an online crowd constructed its own verdict in real time. The entitled man ensured his narrative was heard too. He gave interviews that framed his act as a parent protecting his child, as if the power differential, man to custodian, was not part of his guilt but a necessary correction. The district moved to distance, and in doing so, it allowed rumor to become fact. In the cafeteria after morning announcements, a student leaned toward another and said, "Did you see what he did to the janitor?" The words were small, but they traveled. A teacher made a quiet decision and texted Alina, "We need to look at the recordings. This needs more than a statement." A custodian from another wing wrote a message of support that found its way onto a flyer someone had slapped onto the break room board. "Stand with Bernard." The room bristled with small acts of rebellion and gestures of helplessness. For Molly, the world was a simpler machinery. She went to preschool that day because her father had willed himself into the folding of ordinary life. She recited a drawing she had made, a father and daughter, 2 stick figures holding hands. At night she asked, "Daddy, will people be nice?" He smoothed the edges of her blanket and said, "Some will. It's okay." His tenderness was real. The rest of the world was louder. Back in Elena's office, the footage played again. She studied it frame by frame. The freeze frame the internet had weaponized showed nothing of the child's stumble or of Bernard's reflex. It showed a single moment, frozen out of sequence. And in that lie, truth had been distorted. She took notes in the margin of her pad, the handwriting small with urgency. There were witnesses to interview, a teacher who had been distracted by a spilled popcorn bucket nearby, a parent who had video from another angle, a child who had been standing on the edge of the spill and had slipped moments before. Each of those people had a version of the same event that filled in a different truth. She called the security office and asked for every available clip.
Protocol told her to be careful. Precedent told her to tread lightly. Victor's voice was in her head. Contain, manage, protect. But the footage had reframed the moral geometry of the evening, and Elena felt the line between duty and cowardice narrowing. She found herself moving, inexorably, toward the duty she owed to truth. Word of the footage's existence leaked in the afternoon. Someone who had seen the playback at the security office whispered to a teacher with a conscience. The teacher, in turn, texted a friend. The rumor did not carry the weight of official sanction, but it carried potential. In the staff room, the conversation slid between fear and hope.
For those who had watched Bernard for years and known him by the shape of his laughter and the way he folded his life around his daughter, the footage promised to change perception. For those who had already traded their opinion for a clearer, louder outrage, it would be too late. Victor moved in the shadows of the process. He organized talking points, drafted the language of the inevitable statement before the evidence could be fully heard. "We must be seen to respond," he told Elena when he had the chance. "A school cannot be the center of controversy. Donors pull, parents panic." His diction held the familiar chill of a machine that treated moral dilemmas as PR problems. Elena listened, and then she thought of a classroom full of children whose attention could be consumed by the cascade of adult behaviors around them. She thought of the message it would send if authority folded to the heat of spectacle. In the stillness of her office, watching a man she barely knew on his knees in a clip, she felt a decision settle like a tool in her hand. She would not let a mistaken frame define a man's life without giving the truth a fighting chance. Her next step was careful but decisive. She called the head of HR and asked to convene a review panel. She asked for witnesses to be interviewed before any final personnel action was taken. She scheduled a meeting with the superintendent and insisted they watch the full footage together. Her voice did not tremble. The urgency lived in its steadiness. Outside, the town's social heartbeat thudded with pulses of anger and sympathy. Someone organized a petition both for Bernard's reinstatement and for his dismissal. People seemed desperate to choose sides because picking a side reduced the uncertainty life had given them. News vans idled with cameras pointing like unmoving birds. On the web, the clip had already taken on a life as shorthand for greater anxieties. Class tensions, institutional cowardice, online hunger for scandal. The comment threads read like a town square in revolt. At home that evening, Bernard tried to explain the leaf to Molly the way he could explain moths or rain, phenomena that happen but that you learn to live around. He did not want to teach her to fear authority. He wanted her to understand that sometimes people would move to believe the easier lie. He taught her to greet the world with a cautious kindness. Molly drew him a picture of someone holding a mop like a trophy and insisted on tucking it into his jacket pocket. Something in that small gesture made him press his forehead to the page, and for a moment breathe in the smell of crayons and the invulnerability of a child's love. On the day the superintendent arrived to watch the footage, a collection of staff and witnesses assembled in the principal's small conference room.
The entitled man demanded the school banish Bernard. His spokesperson, a quiet man with a knack for framing protests as morals, paced at the edge of the meeting like someone who had rehearsed his outrage. He carried in his pocket the same certainty that had been broadcast online. The room within the school smelled of stale coffee and the flattened anxiety of people who have worked here more years than they deserve. Elena hit play. The footage ran through its sequence. The minor details that the internet's frenzied eye had missed, the child's stumble, Bernard's immediate attempt to steady a small body, a hand raised in frustration, not as a rebuke but as a reflex to a fall, became vivid in the larger context. The entitled man's gestures took on a new color, less a protector than an instigator, performing a show that fit his narrative. The superintendent's face, composed into the office's standard inscrutable neutrality, loosened. The counselor, who had a child's best interest imprinted into every choice, exhaled. The meeting's conversation shifted, quickening with a new purpose. The initial inclination toward containment receded. "We need to be sure," the superintendent said, and that phrase moved from risk management to moral imperative. There would be interviews, timestamps checked, witnesses recorded, and an official statement prepared that would reflect a fuller truth. Victor warned against the danger of the narrative that had already gone out. Elena's recalibration took him by surprise. He had anticipated a different path, a quiet removal, a downplayed apology. Instead, she proposed a different posture, one that risked the institution's immediate ease for the sake of an individual's dignity. Outside the room, the world churned with the same indifferent momentum. The entitled parent waited for validation, certain the school would bow. The cameras kept their patient glare. On one corner of the internet, someone had stitched the single frame into a new headline. On another, a guardian pulled up the security footage and noted the missing pieces. The school's reputation hung in the balance, a rope taut between outrage and truth. Bernard, in his small apartment, turned the news on, and watched with an odd detachment. He watched faces give him away, and then watch as the smallest of mercies, the presence of an administrator willing to look, slid slowly into place. He knew the kind of courage it took to do something public on principle when easier options abounded. He had seen that courage before in tiny gestures, a teacher speaking up during a meeting, a neighbor bringing a casserole. He felt gratitude and fear braided into something raw. The next morning, Elena stood in the hallway outside the gym, where the event had taken place. The tiles looked the same as they had on the night of the gala, streaks reflecting a day not yet decided. Students streamed past, oblivious to the way adults rearranged their moral furniture.
A teacher passed, and they exchanged a look that held more than words. Elena's phone buzzed. It was Victor again, circumspect in his language now, offering compromises that smelled of salvaging something without exposing anything. She took a breath and dialed a number she had been hesitant to call, the number of a local reporter known to follow the truth rather than sensational headlines. "I have something you should see," she said into the phone, and her voice was steady. She arranged for a controlled release, a scheduled statement that would acknowledge the full footage after interviews were completed. It was a delicate balancing act between transparency and responsibility. As the morning moved into a hard, bright noon, a teacher's voice rose in the staff room and then fell into a hush as phones chimed with new notifications. The clip that had once lived in an outrage silo now had a rival piece, an unedited frame-by-frame from the security footage, less glamorous than a viral snippet, but more faithful. The school braced for the arrival of consequence, the intangible, messy, public kind that leaves a different sort of mark than bruises. Bernard went back to work that afternoon to drop off a change of shirts, to check his locker, to say a strained hello to colleagues who were trying their best to be kind without exposing themselves to the storm. He carried his mop like the handle of a life he was not ready to lose. He moved through corridors that felt both familiar and treacherous. A student nodded at him, eyes learning the map of someone's humanity. He felt weight in his chest, heavy and not wholly negative. The weight of being visible. The day hung between the old narrative and the possibility of correction. Elena prepared a script that was not a speech but a promise. To follow evidence. To restore dignity where it had been taken. To examine the institutional failures that had allowed rumor to outrun truth. She scheduled interviews. She made calls. She sat with the footage once more and underlined the moments that mattered. A child's stumble. A man's reflex to help. A shove that did not fit the initial interpretation. The evidence had a clarity in the light of proper viewing that it lacked in the fragmented theater of social media. At 4 o'clock, as light thinned in the windows and the gym's bleachers cooled like a staged memory, Elena stood in the doorway of the principal's office watching the security feed play on a larger screen. She watched the single frame that had shattered a life, and then watched it fall into place within a fuller sequence that spoke a different truth. She felt the public's hunger for the neat line between villain and hero fade in the face of complexity. Her next actions would not be simple. They would risk criticism for the choices she made, and for the institution's public vulnerability.
But she had a choice that night, to follow the easier path of containment or to act in a way that might restore something essential. She picked up the phone to call the superintendent. Her finger hovered over the screen. In that breath, everything stalled. The petty choreography of PR, the quick decisions that flatten nuance, the comfort of silence that shields institutions. And she chose a course that would not be easy, that would demand explanation and expose failure. She pressed the call, and when the voice answered, she said plainly, "We need to talk about Bernard. We need to talk about Bernard." The superintendent's voice on the line was a practiced flatness, a habit formed in the long, careful career of saying little while doing less. Elena did not wait for him to finish the rehearsed script. She said simply, "I have the footage. We owe him the truth, and the community owes the kids the truth." She could hear the faint click of someone filing papers on the other end, a bureaucrat's counterpoint to a mother's certainty. By mid-morning the next day, Elena's small office had the pallor of an operating room, a stack of witness statements on the desk, a legal pad with timestamps, a laptop that smelled faintly of old coffee and new decisions. She moved with the single-mindedness of someone who had decided to do the hard thing. She called a teacher who had been by the concession stand, a woman named Maria Costa who smelled, Elena later noticed, of cinnamon and the persistent kindness of people who spend their days with children. Maria's recollection was steady, a child's cry, a scramble, Bernard's hands reaching, and then the hard interruption of a man whose temper had written the scene loud enough for 1,000 strangers to misread. "Are you sure?" Elena asked, not because she doubted Maria, but because the act of confirmation was its own small sanctification. Maria's voice was direct. "He helped a kid. He leaned in. He wiped. Then the parent pushed him. It wasn't—" She stopped, searching for the language adults use when they try not to break someone with words. "It wasn't what it looked like." Elena made another call to the security office. The technician on duty, a man named Henry who had worked nights and known the building's every creak, pulled duplicate files and burned the footage to a secure drive. Elena watched again, frame by frame, like a reader parsing a sentence for meaning. Each angle assembled a fuller picture. The child's slip, Bernard's reflex, the parent's shove. Where the internet had wanted a villain, the footage offered a messier human truth. A protective motion misread as confession, a shove read as correction. It was obvious when the 3 camera angles were stitched together. The single frame that had become a weapon was suddenly an ugly lie.
Word that the school had more footage leaked by the end of the morning, but this time the leak was a different animal. Teachers who had seen the full tape began to speak in guarded terms with trusted reporters. A staff member texted a friend who texted a friend. The rumor mill shifted. The narrative that had congealed overnight loosened its grip. And yet Elena could feel the tension of reversal. Moving too fast might look like damage control. Moving too slow might leave a man in the meantime. Victor Hale watched all of this like a chess player watching pawns move. He paced the darker edges of the process, clipboard in hand, his talking points folded like an armor he never felt the need to remove. "We must plan our release," he said when Elena brought him the evidence. "We have to control the narrative. A full release without counsel will play poorly. There are parents who will be angry regardless. There are donors who will react." Elena could have agreed. It would have been the easier path. A soft, careful statement, an apology to all parties for the distress, a promise to review procedures. But the footage had a gravity to it that made neutral language feel like an insult. She imagined Bernard in his kitchen, careful as he stitched the evening to routine, the weight of a public lie growing in his chest. That image stalled more of her usual calculation than her fear of a boardroom spat. "We'll prepare a statement," she said, "but it will reflect what we know. We will invite the reporters to view the full footage with us. We will not let a freeze frame define a man's life." Victor's mouth tightened. "You realize the optics of that?" "I realize what being right looks like sometimes," Elena said, and she did not soften it. No one in the room asked whether she was brave or foolish. They kept asking how to thread the needle between transparency and chaos. Elena chose transparency. She arranged for a controlled press viewing that afternoon in the small auditorium. The school allowed a handful of local reporters in, the ones known for nuance rather than sensational headlines. She also invited a representative from the district and the security lead. She had asked Bernard's supervisor for a list of staff willing to speak, and she offered Bernard the support of a liaison who could accompany him if he chose to attend. He did not come. The thought of entering the school where 1,000 eyes had seen only a lie would have been a cruelty she could not ask him to bear. Instead, he sat in his small kitchen with a casserole on the counter, and Janet kept him company until the light turned as it always did. Inside the auditorium, Elena cued the footage. For a room used to student recitals and PTA meetings, the hush felt like prayer. Frame after frame unfolded. The child's misstep, a wet shoe, Bernard bending, not as a supplicant but as a reflexive guardian, his mop a tool and a shield.
Then the shove, a parent's hand heavy on a shoulder, a man whose performance of dominance transformed a private impulse into public spectacle. The sequence resolved the lie in a way that words alone could not. Reporters asked questions. "Why the delay?" one asked, eyes trained for hypocrisy. Elena answered with a steady voice that showed no need for rhetorical gloss. "We watched the evidence. We interviewed witnesses. We could have issued a statement earlier, but we owed Bernard, not the internet, our best effort to find the truth." Outside, online commentators recalibrated. It did not happen in an instant. Outrage has its own economy of momentum. But the frame that had once been sharp and unambiguous began to soften under scrutiny. Some who had posted in haste retracted with the fugitive shame of those who realized the hunger of the moment was their own failing. Others dug in, refusing to be moved. The internet does not hand back certainty lightly. Elena knew that proving a truth was only the beginning. The school had to do more than say sorry. It had to act. She drafted a formal apology that was not an attempt to placate every irritation, but a public reparation. A statement that acknowledged the school's initial failure to recognize the full context, a clear exoneration of Bernard, and a promise of concrete measures. She placed a call to the district to schedule a public meeting. She prepared a list of institutional changes she planned to propose: mandatory bystander training for staff and volunteers, explicit protections for custodial and support staff, an on-site welfare fund to assist employees facing sudden hardship, and an internal review into how rumors and social media were allowed to shape policy before evidence was gathered. When Elena walked into the boardroom that evening, she carried the footage on a flash drive and the names of witnesses in her pocket.
The boardroom smelled of old varnish and the stale confidence of people who had governed from comfortable heights. The entitled parent arrived wearing a suit that seemed to dare the room to punish him. He had created a narrative of parent as protector and expected gratitude for his willingness to intervene. He shifted in his chair when Elena stepped forward. "I watched the footage," she said simply. "I watched it frame by frame. Bernard was trying to prevent a child from falling. He was not what your clips made him. We owe him an apology. We also owe the staff and students clearer protections against the way outrage can masquerade as moral clarity." There was a murmur. Victor, at the edge of the table, opened his mouth to advise caution. The PTA president, who had been riding a wave of moral certainty until a few hours before, blinked as if recalibrating a compass. The entitled parent wilted where he sat, as if someone had quietly changed the choreography and left him exposed. He had expected validation. Instead, he found himself under the strange light of accountability.
"I don't accept that," he said. His voice was edged, image carefully placed for anyone who might be taking notes. Elena nodded. "We'll offer you the chance to present your perspective, but you will not be a voice of authority on this campus while an investigation proceeds. We are moving to suspend your volunteer privileges pending a full review." The room reacted the way rooms do when someone exercises power in a way that had not been agreed upon in the memo. Some people clapped softly, a private relief. Others watched Elena as if she had upset a table they depended on. By the end of the week, the school's official posture had shifted. The district released a carefully worded statement that reflected the evidence. Bernard's actions had been protective. The clip had been taken out of context. The district regretted the harm done by the rushed optics. Bernard's temporary leave was rescinded and replaced by an invitation, a meeting to discuss restitution. The school offered to cover his lost wages for the days he had been off work, and the district approved a one-time hardship fund contribution to help with immediate bills. None of this erased the days he had lost, or the way his neighbor's casserole could not replace dignity, but it was a kind of material acknowledgement that the school had failed him. The entitled parent, whose name Elena, for the purposes of the public statement, refrained from repeating, was suspended for all volunteer duties and required to attend a restorative meeting with school leaders and the family involved. He protested it as an injustice. Others read it as an overdue consequence. The matter did not require a court order to be meaningful. It required the school's willingness to assert boundaries. The board accepted Elena's recommendations to implement clearer policies on volunteer conduct and the immediate revocation of campus privileges for adults who engaged in harassment. Not everyone was satisfied. A small but loud contingent of social media users accused the school of covering up. Some of the parents who had initially cheered found themselves recalibrating, and then in private apologizing for having joined a pylon without facts. It is ugly how quickly people can cheer for the loudest voice and forget to ask whether it is the right one. Bernard received a call to come in. He arrived with Janet at his side, a kind of armor in human form. He wore the same blue work shirt he always did, the one with a faint bleach stain near the cuff that he had never quite managed to remove. He sat across from Elena at the conference table with a cautious dignity, the kind you see in people who have been taught to keep their lives private lest they be measured and found wanting. "We'd like to apologize," Elena said, and in the simplicity of the sentence there was a gravity that felt like a stone placed with care. She read the written apology the district had prepared, words that acknowledged failure and promised change.
Then she added the institutional measures: wages for the days he had been on leave, a discretionary hardship payment, and an offer for him to help the district shape the new policies for staff protection and volunteer conduct if he wished. It was not a check that would erase the fear, but it was a recognition that the school could be a place that repaired when it had been wrong. "The kids to be safe. I want the people who clean these halls to be treated like humans." He paused, and for a moment his gaze landed on the window, where a child chased the light of a flying tag. "If my telling them what happened helps that, then okay." Elena offered him a role on the task force anyway, not as a favor, but because his daily proximity to the school's rhythms made his perspective necessary. She wanted him to help draft language that would protect staff, to help design the bystander training, and to be a visible part of the restoration. He accepted not because he wanted a podium, but because he did not want others to suffer what he had. The entitled parent was required to meet with a restorative circle. It was a public humiliation of a different kind. He was asked to listen to the harm his actions had caused, to hear Bernard describe the vulnerability of a night shift worker who kept children's spaces clean, to recognize how his need to perform authority had compounded the damage. He resisted at first, metal in his jaw. Later, a note of apology arrived, brief, ungraceful, perhaps genuine. The school chose not to boast of the reconciliation. Restorative justice seldom looks like a headline. Victor did not go quietly into the night. He warned Elena of donors and parents who might pull support, of the reputational cost of letting a narrative complicate itself. Elena looked at him as if measuring the distance between his spreadsheet and the people who polished their shoes in the cloakroom. "We will risk the board's discomfort," she said, "because an institution that pretends not to err is a house built on sand." He shrugged. "Every institution makes choices," he said, as if the weather made the moral calculus lighter.
One of the harsher lessons played out in the inboxes of teachers who had wanted to speak up earlier but stayed silent. Maria, the teacher by the concession stand, had been one of the few who texted immediately, "We need to look at the footage." Her note had been small and brave, an act that later, in a staff meeting, teachers framed as the beginning of their obligation to one another. Elena convened a staff forum and listened as colleagues spoke of cowardice and courage, of the fear of picking a fight that might cost them their jobs, and of the small private acts of defiance that had kept Bernard human to the people around him.
In the weeks that followed, the school rolled out the changes Elena had proposed. A staff protection policy made explicit that volunteers had no right to physically confront staff, that any adult on campus would be subject to immediate temporary suspension of privileges pending investigation, and that staff accused publicly would be afforded support and an investigatory process that prioritized evidence over spectacle. A small fund for employee emergencies was established, fed by district contributions and a local nonprofit that had watched the arc of Bernard's story and wanted to help. A mandatory training module on social media literacy and bystander responsibility was written with Bernard and Maria in the room, an action that felt both symbolic and practical. The most difficult change was cultural. Policies can be drafted and funds can be allocated, but the harder work is shifting the reflex that reaches for the camera before it reaches for the truth. To that end, Elena organized a series of school assemblies, not to recount the scandal, but to teach children how to see beyond a single frame. She asked Bernard to come in and show a group of fourth graders the difference between a picture and a story. He did so with a simplicity that disarmed the room. He showed them how many invisible acts stitch the school together, the way a janitor picks up a loose shoe at recess, the way a lunchtime worker wipes a spill without being asked. "We keep things safe," he told them, kneeling for emphasis in front of a line of small faces. "And sometimes the work you don't see is the work that keeps you from falling." Some students later made drawings that hung in the hallway, stick figures with mops drawn as capes. Parents posted photos from the assemblies with messages that read, in variations, "We learned something today." A small but persistent culture shift began. Younger children learned to call for help rather than cheer when a person in authority performed indignation. Bernard's life did not swing into easy prosperity. The hardship check eased immediate pressure, but the rent was a stubborn thing. He worked his shifts with the same exhausted precision. He found himself recognized in the hallway in a way that was not the old invisibility, but a new visibility that often came with questions and smiles. He accepted the task force role with a guarded optimism. He sat at meetings between administrators and parents, his hands marked with the habit of work, and whispered suggestions that came from years of watching a building breathe and falter. He argued for compassionate scheduling, for paid sick days for custodial staff, for a hotline that staff could use to report threats without risking their careers. Janet, who had kept watch, breathed easier when the school community rallied in small acts. A teacher brought over pie, a parent offered to watch Molly after school for a week, and a colleague helped Bernard with an application for a small emergency grant.
But the impact that stayed with him most was not material, though it mattered. Rather, it was the slow accumulation of apology. A child who had laughed at the gym now came up to him during lineup and offered a timid, "Sorry, Mr. K." The words landed like an unpolished jewel, small, insufficient, but real. The entitled parent tried to rebuild his narrative in quieter ways. He attended the restorative meeting, read the words he'd been given to say, and then avoided the cameras. The school limited his access to campus events. Some parents grumbled at what they saw as overreach. Others were relieved. The important thing for Elena was not vengeance, but the re-establishment of boundaries that protected the vulnerable. The school board convened a special session to discuss systemic changes. The meeting lasted long into the evening, with a crowd that had come not to shout, but to learn. Elena presented the evidence and the proposed policy changes. She also proposed requiring that any parent who aimed to organize at school be offered a training module on appropriate conduct and the limits of adult intervention. The board voted to adopt her measures with corrections, small and bureaucratic. The vote was a fragile triumph, not the end of the problem, but a material step toward preventing repeats. And then, one autumn morning, after the leaves had started to turn and the air had that thin honesty schools seemed to have in their first months, Elena stood in front of the students in the same gym where the scandal had been born. She had asked Bernard to be there. The assembly was not about relitigating the incident. It was about accountability and the harm that comes when people jump to judgment. There was a video, she told the students, her voice steady and without grandiosity. It showed one frame of a longer story. A man was hurt by what people believed in that frame. We failed him at first because we let a quick image be more important than evidence. That's on us. We're changing that.
Then she did something the school had not expected. She invited the entitled parent to sit in the front row and asked him to stand. He did so, red-faced and awkward. Elena did not aim to shame him, but to give him a chance to be seen for what he had done. "Mistakes have consequences," she said, "and consequences can lead to change." The man muttered an apology, small and stilted. Whether it was sufficient remained a private weighing, but the act of making him stand in front of the children was an explicit refusal to let authority go unchecked. Finally, Elena introduced Bernard. He walked slowly to the center, the gym lights sharp on his shoulders. A hush settled. He did not speak at first. He looked out at the small faces, at the teachers who had stood up for him, at the principal who had chosen to risk the board's displeasure for the sake of truth. His voice, when it came, was quieter than the microphones expected.
"They say the camera tells the truth," he said, "but sometimes the camera forgets the rest of the story. It forgets why someone was there, what they were trying to do. I clean this school because I care about these kids. I do it because somebody has to pick up the trash when the bell rings. I do it because if I don't do it, someone slips. That's what I want you to remember. Look for the story behind the picture." A child raised a hand and asked, "Did that man push you hard?" He smiled, small and rueful. "He pushed," he said, "but we are all allowed to learn from it." That day, several parents who had joined the original chorus of outrage approached Bernard afterward. Some said the awkward things people say when they correct themselves. "I'm sorry, I didn't know, I shouldn't have." They were not all eloquent. He accepted some apologies, declined others, and saved most of his energy for the work ahead. Weeks later, the task force convened with a strange but necessary mix of people: custodial staff, teachers, parents, a legal counsel, and 2 students who had been affected by the way online outrage had made them judge an adult. Bernard's suggestions were practical: a staffing line that ensured coverage during large events, a campus marshal to oversee volunteer interactions, and a requirement that any volunteer undergo a brief orientation that included a section on the limits of adult intervention and an explanation of how the security camera system worked. He insisted on language that treated custodial staff as professionals, titles that reflected dignity, a commitment to fair scheduling, and a reporting procedure that did not force an employee into the limbo of public shame while an investigation unfolded. The new policies did not fix everything. There were parents who still grumbled about their perceived loss of prerogative. There were social media posts that resurfaced occasionally, hungry for the next outrage. But the school had shifted its center of gravity. The staff felt safer to speak with administrators about past incidents that had been let go in the name of expediency. The teachers began to trust that the institution would not always choose the most convenient scapegoat. Months later, an event that used to attract only a thin crowd now felt like a small festival. The PTA organized a Caregivers Appreciation Night, where the custodial, cafeteria, and maintenance staff were invited as guests of honor. The evening smelled of lemon pie and the faint tang of industrial cleaner, a scent that no longer signaled only exhaustion, but now carried a new undertone: appreciation. Molly, 5 and full of the earnest honesty of children, ran a small art table and handed a paper crown to her father. He wore it like a joke and then like pride. At the podium, Elena made a speech that resisted the theatrical. "We cannot undo what happened," she said, "but we can learn from it.
We can change how we react to images and how we protect those who keep our school running. Today, we celebrate a community that chooses to do better." Bernard, in front of a crowd that now included faces that had once sneered, stood to tidy a spill that a child had made near the food table. He worked like someone who had been given back a small but vital thing: the permission to be seen without being judged by a single frozen moment. The ripple continued. A small nonprofit contacted the school to partner on a bystander training program they would pilot across several districts. A local paper wrote a long feature that tried to parse the social dynamics that had allowed the clip to do its damage. An article that did not excuse the speed of the outrage, but also refused to let the blame land only on faceless crowds. The entitled parent's influence waned. He did not sue, and the story did not require a courtroom to land. It required an institution to own its mistakes and a community to do the slow work of repair. In quieter corners, the healing looked like small private things: a teacher bringing extra snacks to Bernard's locker, a kid waiting to hold the door for him, a neighbor sharing a pot of soup. Bernard took to walking Molly to school sometimes, hand in hand, teaching her how to notice the people who often go unseen. She would point at the janitors with a child's admiration and call them hero helpers. He would laugh and tuck her hair behind her ear. There were nights he still woke with a cold light in his chest, the residue of being misread, of the world deciding a life was a story before asking for context. But those nights gave way to mornings that felt different in small ways.
greetings from teachers that were not perfunctory, nods from parents that carried a quick thank you. The restoration was not a thunderclap, but a steady rebuilding. On a Sunday afternoon at the local community center where a small group had gathered to talk about the power of images and the human stories behind them, Elena sat in the back and listened as Bernard spoke. He did not have the cadence of a speechmaker. He spoke in the simple honesty that comes from living with hard things and still choosing to show up. I always thought my work spoke for itself, he said. It turns out sometimes it has to be given a voice. He smiled at the room full of people who had become collaborators in the slow work of repair. If anything good came of it, it's that now the work gets to have a voice. The audience clapped, the kind of applause that means, we see you. The community's change did not erase the toll of those first days. There were quiet conversations with counselors, some sleepless nights for Molly when strangers online wrote hurtful things. But there was also a school that had learned to value nuance, and a principal who had discovered the moral cost of doing what was easy.
Elena, when she found herself alone in her office late one night, thought often of that paused moment in the gym when she had decided not to look away. She had expected the board's ire, the donors' displeasure, even the uncomfortable reframing of her own leadership. She had not expected how many people would eventually stand with her. Months into the new school year, a small plaque was mounted near the staff lounge. It was not a monument to heroism, Elena had refused that, but a simple line about community responsibility. Bernard saw it one morning as he passed, mop balanced at his side. He stopped and ran a hand over the metal. It was the sort of recognition that did not change the nature of work, but changed how people treated one another while it was being done. One afternoon, a reporter caught up with him when he was finishing a shift. "Do you want to say anything to people who saw only a frame?" she asked. The question is old as cameras themselves. He thought of Molly sleeping with her stuffed rabbit, of Janet banging her pots in a kind of domestic applause, of the students who had drawn him as a caped stick figure. He thought of Elena's decision to fight for truth rather than optics, and of the way a community had slowly learned to calibrate outrage with care. "A single picture doesn't tell the whole thing," he said at last, "but people can choose to ask what else is there. If they do that more often, if they look for the story behind the frame, then we are doing the work we should have done from the start." The reporter smiled and folded her notebook. The clip of the original incident still lived on the internet, a stubborn archive of how quickly a life could be misread. But layered over it now were interviews, statements, policy changes, and most importantly, the quieter things: a child's apology, a neighbor's casserole, a policy drafted with a janitor's hands in the room. The net result was not tidy. It never is, but it was real. At the end of that school year, the district released a short video on social media, an honest, unflashy piece that explained the new policies and shared a few stories about why they mattered. Elena appeared and spoke plainly. Bernard appeared too, briefly, holding Molly on his hip as she waved at the camera with the lack of self-consciousness only a child has. The clip did not go viral. It did not need to. It did land in inboxes and on timelines, a reminder that the internet could host slower, kinder things alongside its hunger. In a world where a single frame had once nearly undone a man, the school learned the costly but necessary art of patience. It learned that institutions, like people, must choose whether they will bend to the first gust of outrage or stand in the wind to shelter someone who had been misread. At home one evening, Janet found Bernard and Molly coloring at the kitchen table. Molly pressed a page toward him, a crayon crown now colored in with careful strokes.
"For when you're a hero," she announced, certain in the way children are about the world. Bernard took the crown and placed it gently on his head. He looked at Janet, who shrugged as if she had merely done what neighbors do. He looked at Molly, and then at the small stack of bills by the phone, and the folder with his task force notes. His life had been bruised. It had been mended in certain ways, and in others it would take time. But he had been restored in a manner that mattered, publicly, with accountability, and with systemic change that might protect others. Outside, the light fell soft and golden, and for a moment the apartment felt like the center of a small, true world. Bernard breathed in the smell of crayons and leftover casserole. He felt the weight of the work and the lightness of being seen not as a snapshot, but as a life. If this moved you, share the story, and remember, a single frame doesn't tell the whole truth.